the the answers would be different depending on whether it was called the Affordable Care Act or whether it was called Obamacare. And that people generally supported the Affordable Care Act in much greater numbers than they supported Obamacare. So the careful and responsible pollsters are very conscientious in trying to phrase questions in as neutral a way as possible to avoid sort of putting the thumb on the scale to try to influence a particular answer. We talk a lot about pseudo polls, which are often fundraising under the guise of a public opinion poll. You may get the Sierra Club's National Voter Survey or the National Rifle Association Survey or
the Democratic Party.
Democratic Party, the Idaho Freedom Caucus, and they will ask your opinions, and you will, but you know that nobody's ever going to read the opinions because all they want is your check.
But the ones that I dislike even more are the ones where you read very carefully and you can't tell where this survey came from, who's behind it. You know, and there's no disclosure of who's responding, and that's frequently the kind when you get the questions where there is no good answer. They're all obviously pointed right, left, up, down, whatever.
One of the things that APOR, the Association for Public Opinion Research, insists on is transparency.
Yes.
And that survey respondents should know who is taking the survey, and a reputable pollster will make copies of the results available if, as a condition of your participating.
But I've gotten a couple recently that have no idea where they came from, and there was only a P.O. box for return address.
Yeah, and those were mail polls? And were they asking for money or anything?
One of them didn't. I can't remember the other one. But I always look for who's mailing this to me. And when there's no return address on the, I mean, there's a return address.
A P.O. box, but no name. That's fair. So Gary and then Lee and then
Kenton, if some organization, let's say Pew, is doing a poll and then they repeat it every 6 months, or they say, we've been doing this, asking people the same thing for 3 or 4 years, do they use the same group of people that they ask, or is each time they ask this a different group?
Good question, and it can be both or either. The Gallup survey has been doing presidential approval ratings since the 50s, and they recently changed, and they're using some different methodology now, but they tend to create a new sample each time. They would do a presidential approval rating every week with a different sample. They would try to match the demographics of the broader population, but it rarely would be, maybe by coincidence you might get the same person called more than once. The Los Angeles Times, in the run-up to the 2018 election, did something called panel surveys, where they had sort of a pool of potential respondents, and they would go back to them at weekly or bi-weekly intervals to find out if their opinions had changed, if somebody had gone from neutral to a weak Clinton supporter to a strong Clinton supporter, or vice versa. And in many respects, the LA Times, at least for the polls, had a pretty good measure, in part because they were going back to the same people. So it is an accepted technique, but it's more expensive because it takes more effort to you may have to go back again and again to get the same respondent.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on polling's role in identifying cheating in elections?
Cheating by candidates or cheating by voters or?
For example, scrubbing the voter rolls of potential Hillary voters, Chris Kobach's Operation Cross-Check, or maybe, the hacking into the voting machines. It seems like polling could help identify when that happens.
If there were cases where the actual election results differed greatly from the pre-election polls, that might be an indicator. That probably would be more useful in state elections than in the national elections, I would think. But it would take a watchdog-oriented news organization to use that polling data as a piece of evidence to show that there had been voter suppression or attempts to keep people from voting. I'll follow up on that. I can see if there's anyone who has, I'm thinking of North Carolina in particular, where the House races were so close, and the overall vote for Democrats was more than 50%, yet they got only 3 of 13 House seats in North Carolina. And that's a result of both gerrymandering and probably some voter suppression.
Trump was right, it is rigged.
What are the signs of those two?
So, Louise, let me come back then.
So that was a great segue to my question. You gave some examples of some of the variables that contribute to reliability of polling. And I'm wondering, there seems to be an escalation in the number of variables now. You talked about gerrymandering. I'm thinking about this prospect of having citizenship question on the census for 2020. The shy voters, or the ones who maybe think, in your face, I'm going to mess with the pollster, or I'm going to not disclose my political persuasion. But the question about electoral college, all these different things for this, how do pollsters adequately control for that escalating number of variables, and not the least of which is Russia,
The biggest obstacle to accurate polling in this country is telemarketers.
Yeah.
Because so many people are reluctant to answer the phone if it's an unknown number. People have gone increasingly to cell phones only as opposed to landlines. How many people in this room still have a landline at home? Oh, okay, well, you're a different demographic. I mean,
We're not normal. Doesn't matter.
yeah, if you ask my students, they're cell phone only, and sometimes mobile cell phones, and the same. So the issue of getting an accurate response depends on the willingness, as the Pew Center director said at the end, the willingness of people to participate in polls and to be able to separate the people that are trying to sell you something or get you on their mailing list from those who have a legitimate question. So, but as you say, Nancy, there are lots of variables that make getting accurate polls results more difficult. But there's a huge effort nationwide, both by academic organizations and the Association of Professional Pollsters, to keep plugging away and finding new methods. One way that people are actually more willing to participate in an email survey than they are in a telephone survey. And so that Stuart Elway, who's the leading pollster in Seattle for the state of Washington, is doing more hybrid polling, where the samples are selected randomly and people are emailed and invited to participate. And once they know that it's a legitimate poll and not a sales technique, they are willing to respond to a telephone survey. So, but every time you add another step, it adds the cost, and which makes it less likely that it's going to be done in a state like Idaho, just because the population base is so small. I mean, there were hardly any polling in Idaho on the governor's race. There was a little bit of polling on Proposition 1, the horse racing one, because the group behind that was very well funded. Hardly any on Proposition 2 on Medicaid, because all of their efforts were directed to first the gathering signatures and then getting people to vote. In contrast to Seattle, where you've got big news organizations with lots of money who are willing to spend on polling.
Have you looked at the city's poll that they just put out, it's done by mail, on whether or not people in Moscow want educational institutions downtown? It came out last week.
I haven't, I saw the headline, but I haven't looked at the methodology or how the sample was selected.
Yeah, I think they were saying in one of the meetings that there's a 4% margin for, and it was they sent out a lot for the general poll, and there's another poll
For
downtown
business.
Yeah, downtown business on our landowners, and that was like 2,500 surveys sent out by mail, and I think they got a lot back. I don't remember the exact number.
So I'll look into that. I'm not sure how they would have selected the respondents, and whether they were using voter rolls or property owners or utility bills, maybe would give you both owners and renters. Louise, did you have another question?
No, actually, you answered the question. It was kind of a follow-up to Lee's question. But I do understand, I just did a poll recently, and it was from political entities, and they were all the "have you stopped beating your wife" kind of questions, which was, found its way into the recycle bin.
So Jennifer, do you
Well, I
have
just,
one quick one?
this is about the 2018 election, and I wonder if the polls drove the election in a way, because people who were Clinton voters could be a little complacent, and if it rained, they figured, well, she's going anyway. People who really, really didn't like Hillary said, by God, I'm getting the poll no matter what, and I'm going to vote because I can't stand
And
it.
a lot of them said, I'm voting for Trump because I can't stand Hillary.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear that a
And,
lot.
yeah,
And the political psychologists who look, especially at voter behavior, study that sort of symbiotic relationship between what the polls are saying and how people act. And it is true that people respond both to the news reports as well as to the polls themselves. And so it's not, nobody votes in a vacuum. They're influenced by what they read and hear and see online.
Kent, you mentioned at the beginning that you were going to come tell us about some new things that people are interested in trying. Did you cover that? I know you mentioned one.
Just the deliberative polling by Fishkin.
So I have a question. There was I think it was a Harvard researcher or Princeton researcher that he actually predicted the election, but he looked at, what he found was the most private thing people have, which is their Google searches. And he was able to predict it accurately because by Google searches, he went to, say, traditionally, overwhelmingly black districts, because what he said in Google searches typically what you do before an election. This is just an example, and I'm just paraphrasing the podcast that I listened to, where people query, polling places, et cetera. And he was able to accurately predict the outcome in all these different districts. I think based on the fact that, the Google searches, asking about polling places. Also, he said there was a spike in in racist searches and misogynistic searches. So I don't know if you looked into that at all, because I find that fascinating, because I mean, we all use Google, and it's one of the most private things we all do. Because you might not talk about it in public. You know, he was talking about like, you know, he even brought up, I think in the article, he said, you know, even pornography. I mean, think about like the things that people will look up on Google that they would never discuss openly, so.
I
It's really
have looked
fascinating.
into that. My colleague Katie Blevins, who studies social media and social change, done quite a bit of work on the Women's March of January 2017, and how, particularly on Twitter and Instagram, that became a mobilizing tool. And I'll ask her if she's done anything on the Google search, because I think there may be something to the theory, and if it proved accurate, that people were searching for polling places, and if you were able to look by state or congressional district or even precinct to know that you could certainly have a good measurement of interest